But they were shocked to know that the shortest edition came from Kerala. And they said, Kerala is so far from North India, the other extreme of India. So how did the shortest version, which will be as close as possible to the original, how did it reach Kerala? Then one scholar traced the journey of the Mahabharata. I'm giving this story, it doesn't answer your question directly, but it's very, very interesting. I found it very interesting. So he said that before the British came, India was not politically united, it was not culturally united, and was divided into thousands and thousands of small units. So this was an attempt to demoralize us and to make us feel very inferior to the colonial masters. They describe the Dussehra festival. How does the ruler of Vijayanagar celebrate Dussehra? And the massive military power on display. Absolutely fascinating. In his palace, he only had women guards. So these kind of things, which are there from the writings of these European travelers. Now that Jain Mill's History of British India, it had one basic theme, and that was to denigrate Indian civilization and to make the people who are selected inculcate a sense of superiority. So he makes two very important points. One is that the Sati was a phenomena that was exaggerated by the British Baptist missionaries, and he didn't see anything in the South. And he says he sees widows with shaved head. And then he also talks about the absolute impossibility of converting the people.
Namaste, Meenakshi Ji.
Namaskar.
I think we can start with the introduction from Vidya Ji, and we will take it forward. Vidya Ji.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Namaste, Meenakshi Ji. Very happy to see you here.
Namaskar.
Okay. So, namaste and a very good morning to everyone here. Thank you, Ravishankar Ji, for yet another opportunity to introduce our guest for today, who is none other than one of India's most renowned, authoritative, eminent historians, Padma Shri Dr. Meenakshi Jain. Meenakshi Ji, who is an Indian political scientist too, along with being a historian, developed a very keen interest in history at a young age because of her father, the late Shri Girilal Jain, who was himself an eminent journalist and the editor of the Times of India. After having done her honors in history from Lady Shri Ram College, Meenakshi Ji went on to do both her post-graduation as well as her PhD in political science from the University of Delhi. So Meenakshi Ji is an academician, a researcher, a prolific writer, all rolled in one. And in 2020, she became the recipient of India's fourth highest civilian award, the Padma Shri, for her contribution to the field of literature and education. Her areas of research include the cultural and religious developments in Indian history. Meenakshi Ji has been a senior fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research since 2014 and currently has a senior fellowship at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. She has authored several books and publications. Parallel Pathways, which was published in 2010, then The India They Saw, Foreign Accounts of India from the 8th to mid-19th century, all of 3 volumes, which was published in 2011. Rama and Ayodhya, which was published in 2013. This is based on the Rama Janmabhoomi. One of her most important and authoritative works, which is Sati, Evangelicals, Baptist Missionaries, and the Changing Colonial Discourse, which was published in 2016, for which Meenakshi Ji had done extensive research on the subject of Sati and colonial debates that preceded the eventual abolishment in 1829. Her next publication, The Battle for Rama, Case of the Temple at Ayodhya, was published in 2017. In 2019, she wrote another book, The Flight of Deities and Rebirth of Temples, which is based on episodes from Indian history, examining the medieval response to temple destruction and desecration of images. Her next was Vasudeva Krishna and Mathura, which was published in 2021, in which she put forward a detailed examination of the sacred literary and epigraphic evidence which clearly presents the antiquity of Sanatana Dharma. In 2023, January, Meenakshi Ji published her latest book, The Hindus of Hindustan, a civilizational journey which highlights the underlying features of Indian civilization that manifested from the time it was founded and has gone on to remain unchanged over the millennia. Dr. Meenakshi Jain, Meenakshi Ji, it's truly an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. We can't wait to hear you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome, Ravi and Vidya. And I have to really appreciate all those people who have joined early on Sunday morning to be involved and participate in this discussion. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, truly honored to have you with us, Meenakshi.
It's an honor that is mine.
Excellent introduction, Vidya ji, as always. And thank you, Meenakshi ji, for being with us. And I think actually we can start with our questions. As I mentioned earlier, today's session will be in an interview format. And in the first hour, the moderators will ask the questions. And from an hour later, we will open up for public questions and we'll take it from there. So Meenakshi ji, the first question from our moderator's side is, you can say a cliched question. Most likely because even after the independence, 75 years after independence, we still hear that from many corners, we hear that the India as a nation is being created by the Europeans. So my question is there any contribution towards Europeans in creating a nation of India? Does it hold any water?
A very relevant question, especially in today's times. The fact is that centuries before the Europeans came into India, we can trace the idea of India as one political unit from ancient texts. You see, I just want to give a backdrop to your readers, to your viewers. Why did this question that India is not a nation before the British advent, why did it come up in the 19th century? You see, the British, they wanted to justify their presence in India. And for that, they presented various arguments. And one of the arguments that was presented by Sir John Strachey, it was most eloquently put forward by him. He said, before the British came, there was no such thing as India. No nation of India, no people of India, of which we hear so much. So he said that before the British came, India was not politically united, it was not culturally united, and was divided into thousands and thousands of small units. So this was an attempt to demoralize us and to make us feel very inferior to the colonial masters. But the thing is that many Indologists, early historians of India, they examined this at length. And it is so surprising that when India was under firm colonial rule, they were able to challenge this view. And the first evidence that they have, first of all, they looked at the ancient texts and they presented the view that by 500 BCE, the whole landmass of the subcontinent was known to the people of India. So I don't want to get into that, but they have quoted various texts beginning from the Rig Veda, going to the Shatpat Brahmana, which talks about the discovery of Eastern India, and then further south. So very eminent historians have examined this issue and have come to the conclusion on the basis of verifiable information in ancient texts that by 500 BCE, the whole landmass of the subcontinent was known to what we can call the framers of Indic civilization or Indian civilization. Now, we have to keep in mind that India is such a vast piece of land. And at that time, there were no means of communication that could make the discovery of this landmass an easy process. Keeping that in mind. But the first articulation that we get that India is one political unit, it comes from Kautilya in the Arthashastra. All your viewers have heard of Kautilya. They are familiar with the text called Arthashastra. We can debate when the text was written, but it is very clear that it was before Common Era. So in the Arthashastra, Kautilya says that from the Himalayas to the seas, from the Eastern Ocean to the Western, so he's defining the exact geography of India, from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari, and from the Eastern Ocean to the Western Ocean, India should have one ruler. So, obviously, this was an ideal that he was articulating, because we know that no empire in ancient India got to rule over the whole of the subcontinent. The Mauryan Empire, which was such a large empire, was not able to, control parts of Kerala, Pandya kingdom, etc., which is enunciated and described in Ashoka's edicts. He says that these three kingdoms of South India are not within my political purview, but he talks about the rest of India. So Kautilya is saying that from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari, there should be one unit, and that is the field of the Chakravartin Raja. This awareness of one political unit is absolutely remarkable for such an ancient text. And what is even more remarkable, Ravi, that this concept of Chakravartin Raja, it percolated over the millennia to the smallest ruler of India. So a ruler who could be ruling over 20 villages also said, I'm Chakravartin, because that idea, this one political unit, this is something that is absolutely remarkable. But the unity of India does not only embrace the concept of political unity, it also should, alongside, show awareness of cultural unity. So that awareness of cultural unity also comes by an author before Common Era. This is part of the Atharvaved, and in that the writer says that from the Himalayas again to the seas, east to west, Dharma stands on 4 legs. Dharma stands on 4 legs means that it is unified by one concept of unity, cultural unity. So there are so many more examples, but I think these two should suffice. Like early expression of political unity and early expression of cultural unity.
Very
and
well.
Just one thing I want to add. One thing I want to add. We have to keep in mind that the Indians who challenged this British concept that you quoted, they were living in the times when British power was at its peak. But even then, they were not cowed down by the British thought process. They went back to the text and they presented a very, very powerful counter view.
Yes, Meenakshi Ji. I'll come to the second question. So as far as actually history is concerned, India, Bharat, has actually a long history, and we are wealthy to have actually many historians actually being with us, from Vatmiki to Vyasa with Ramayana and Mahabharata, and after that actually even many others actually from indigenous historians were there. Later Chinese came, Greek came, And the travelers came and actually had their own accounts actually about their history. Then Mughals and many histories are there. But in general, the question is actually now, who all wrote our histories? Who all were they who wrote the history of India?
I would like to divide my answer into two parts. The first part concerns the ancient period, ancient Indian history. The people, early visitors to India, they were attracted by the image that India had created across the world, that this was the land of wisdom. So the earliest person who's supposed to have come to India is Pythagoras. I think we still study Pythagoras' theorem in school. But what is not so well known is that Pythagoras, when he went to his kingdom, he is supposed to have talked about the theory and the philosophy of metempsychosis. Now, what is this theory and philosophy? It is belief in rebirth. And we know that belief in rebirth remains such an integral part of our philosophy and our thought process that even today, you may not find any Indian who's unaware of this, that, you have to take rebirth. So it remained a very important part and remains a very important part of our tradition and philosophy. Pythagoras talked about it in Greece, but after that, we are not able to trace, that continuity of that belief system over there. But in India, it remained a part and remains a part of our thinking, philosophy, and belief system. So what I'm trying to say is that the early people who came to India, they came to India because they were attracted by India's image as the home of wisdom, knowledge, and deep spirituality. And all your viewers would be very aware of the series of Chinese travelers who came. Unsung is the most well-known, but before Unsung, we had other Chinese travelers, and after him, we had other Chinese travelers. By that time, Buddhism had spread to China, Tibet, all these parts. And these people, they were so in awe of the teachings of the Buddha and the philosophies and the different schools that developed after Buddha, that they came in search of Buddhist texts. So we have, Unsung himself writes how many texts he took back, Sanskrit texts he took back. And, he visited Kashmir, he stayed in Nalanda. So important centers of Indian spiritual tradition he visited, and he has written copiously about them. So there is no debate and there is no room for doubt. And all the other Chinese travelers are also, their texts, many of them are available to us. Some of them have been lost and some of them had not been translated. And one thing I want to say to you, if you go to Bodh Gaya, then in the temple, you will find many inscriptions that were recording the presence of Chinese who had come to pay homage at the Mahabodhi temple. So this is very interesting. Now, what happens is that at some point, when we have the birth of the Arab Empire in the Middle East, then the control of the oceans, it goes into the hands of Arabs. So what happens is the direct link between India and Europe gets broken. Before that, there was a direct link, but the direct link, because this entire region becomes an Arab-controlled area. So we do not have any accounts of European travelers who are coming from Europe to India. We have some accounts of European travelers who take the land route and try to reach China. And so they visit India on the way to or back. The most important account which everyone has heard of is by Marco Polo. You see, Marco Polo. And that's a very detailed account. He did not visit all parts of India because he was on the way to China and coming back from China home. He touched only parts of India along the coast. But he writes in detail about India. After that, and so there are some missionaries who are on their way to China, 3-4 of them, and they stop either on the way or on the way back, and we have some letters home, which we have, I've included those in my book that you mentioned, The India They Saw. That's a collection of foreign accounts of India from the 8th to the 19th century. Now, the next important turning point while we're discussing the European accounts of India happens in 1498. Now, what happens in 1498? Vasco da Gama comes to India by a new route and he lands in the south. So, with the advent of Vasco da Gama and the discovery of another route to India, we again have a series of foreign travelers, traders, merchants, educators, people who have come to learn about India. We have many accounts of those. And since they were coming by sea, we have very, very important accounts of the Vijayanagar Empire by 2 Portuguese traders, Nunes and Pais. So those are such vivid accounts. They describe the Dussehra festival. How does the ruler of Vijayanagar celebrate Dussehra? And the massive military power on display. Absolutely fascinating. In his palace, he only had women guards. So these kind of things, which are there from the writings of these European travelers, these are there. Then, of course, we have the advent of various European trading companies, not just the English, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese. Portuguese were the first among the early ones. So Portuguese traders, Dutch traders, French traders, we have very, very important accounts of theirs. And finally, we have of officials of the East India Company. But the important thing to remember, at that time, when these European accounts begin, Mughal Empire was at its peak. So many of these European accounts write in detail about the Mughal court. Akbar had Jesuit priests who stayed in his court. Jahangir, the ambassador, Sir Thomas Roe, who came to Jahangir's court, has written a very, very fascinating account of Jahangir's court. And then, of course, we have so many others. So the people who come now are missionaries, traders, adventurers, and people just want to see, because now travel is again permissible. So they want to see. So it's a very, very rich body of literature that we have. And the best way to tackle this is not to take the whole thing at one go, but take a particular period and a particular area and focus on the accounts that were written at that time. I hope I've not given too much of a detour to your question.
Not at all, not at all. Actually, that was a very vivid that account, and it has actually touched all the areas and eras that we had. Vidya Ji, you can go with the next question.
Yeah. So, Meenakshi Ji, coming back to the early Europeans, what was their approach towards the Indian texts? Like, was it more spiritual, more scientific? How did they approach our texts?
You see, at the at the outset, Indian texts were not available to anyone. Because Indian texts, I presume you mean the sacred literature. That sacred literature was actually, transmitted from one generation to another orally, because it was regarded as sacred literature, and to put it down on paper would be a sacrilege. So the early Europeans who came, they actually did not come until much later looking for sacred texts. They came actually to learn about Indian medicine. Because they were surprised and quite overwhelmed at the Indian tradition of medicine. And they said the knowledge of herbs, it is so profound. And they said, how they cure fever, for example. So we have, accounts of Tom Pyrus. In fact, he was a person who was interested in medicine and herbs. And he writes a letter to his king that he lists the number of herbs that that country should try to procure from India. So, and there's another account, I don't remember, it was a European doctor, physician, and he accompanies one king of South India, and he says that, he has fallen sick. And he says that, I was not able to cure him, but the local physician, whatever you want to call him, was the one who was able to cure him. And then I discovered from him that, if you have fever, what are the best cures for fever? What are the best cures for diarrhea? So these kind of medicinal problems that they encountered. And a little later, there is description of Vigne, Vigne. He describes the process of no surgery. And even later, we have accounts of how they treated smallpox. So, the early accounts were very fascinated by the medicine tradition. They also wanted to understand the rich textile and weaving heritage of India. So, they want to understand how do the Indians print cloth. What are the, so it was actually scientific kind of knowledge that they were in search of. Textiles, how do they emboss a design on a textile? What are the weaving? And chints, and they write, about this muslin of Bengal. They write that it's unbelievable that how do they, weave it? It's so transparent. So the knowledge, the desire to get acquainted with Indian texts, actually the missionaries play a large part. Because, they are grappling with the problem of conversion, how to convert. And they find that Indians are conversion resistant. So, what is it that keeps them rooted to their tradition? And then they start looking for texts. But as I said, the texts, they were not easily accessible to them. But the French Jesuit missionaries, they were instructed by the French emperor and the librarian of that national library in France, in Paris, to collect and send as many texts that they could. And in fact, the library catalog of how many books they got from these Jesuit missionaries is available. So they write, so many copies of the Rig Ved came, so many of the Upanishads came. So it's a detailed thing. Now the point is that once you get these texts, what do you do with them? You have to learn the language. So though the English were the ones who first conquered India, the most important and earliest center of Sanskrit learning was in France. There was an Englishman who was shipwrecked near France, and he was caught. So then the deal was that they would set him free if he taught Sanskrit to the people. So I think his name was Alexander Hamilton, if I'm not mistaken, because I studied this long ago. So France becomes the earliest center of Sanskrit learning. And then, of course, we have the East India Company, their problems, etc. So can I just continue one more thing?
Yes, please go ahead.
So you know, when the East India Company first established their rule in Bengal. So, you know, we have William Jones, we have Halhed, we have Charles Wilkins. These are the early pioneers of the East India Company who tried to grapple with Indian knowledge. And obviously they had to learn Sanskrit. So in the beginning, they write that, you know, the Brahmins were not at all willing to teach us Sanskrit because, you know, there were so many problems teaching a Malach, what they would say, you know, impurity involved in teaching a sacred language and sacred texts to these people. This was an inhibition. Then how do we recompense them? This was a question that the company faced. And the Brahmin said, how can we take money from you? You know, that will be the worst sin that we can do. First of all, we are sharing our knowledge with you, and then to take money from you for that. So in the beginning, the East India Company could not find any Brahmin teachers. And it employed certain Vidyas, you know. And then gradually how they overcame the resistance. It's a long and fascinating story.
Okay. So we'll go with the next, Meenakshi Ji. So of the translations which were made of the Indian text, which would you, according to you, what were the prominent translations?
You see, the earliest of the East India Company was Nathaniel Halhed. He was asked by the company to prepare a manual on Indian laws, which English judges could use in dispensing justice in Bengal. So the thing was that how do we, because we all know as Indians that there is no one text which defines the rules. There are so many. And then South has its own tradition. So there has never been one text that applies to the whole of India. So then the point is that how do we prepare? So first you have to prepare a compilation of important lawgivers. Then that has to be translated in Persian. And then from that, Halhed translated it into English. So it's actually a translation thrice removed. So there were many problems also. But the preface of a code of Gentoo laws was absolutely an amazing piece of writing. Because in that preface, Halhed displays such courage. I'm using the word courage because he challenges the till then dominant view of the antiquity of Indian civilization. So I'll just come to that a little later. So Nathaniel Halhed is the first one. Charles Wilkins also translated. And the most important, of course, was Sir William Jones. Now, I don't want to get into the other works that William Jones translated, but for Europe and for us, he was the person who translated Shakuntala into English. And when he translated Shakuntala into English, it was obviously sent to England. And from there, everybody, for example, Germany, you know, the leading writers and the leading thinkers, when they read Shakuntala, they said there is nothing more for us to read. The gamut of human emotions, the language, the literature, the complexity of the story, it's a classic. So actually Europe became familiar with the richness of India's literary heritage, thanks to Sir William Jones' translation of Shakuntala. Then he translated many other works apart from legal texts that he did. Then, we have people like H.H. Wilson. He translated the Vishnu Puran. And that translation of the Vishnu Puran is still used by many scholars when they want to access the Vishnu Puran. So they came as actually seekers, and they were the early Englishmen and the early officials of the East India Company. They never came with a feeling that, we are superior, or that, they came to understand and to learn. And they felt greatly enriched, and Europe felt greatly enriched by the translations that they did of Indian texts, literary texts.
Yes. You were mentioning actually they came in as seekers, and actually they were actually of a good attitude towards actually Indian texts and wisdom.
Yes.
So when did that attitude change, and how much of it was actually influenced by to have that history fit into the biblical history, or the role of missionaries, or what is your take on it?
So you'll have to give me a little bit of time. The early Englishmen who came to India, they came when they were 13 or 14, because they came as they were employed by the East India Company, and they came actually from, this noble families of England, the third or fourth children of that family. So there was no way that they were going to inherit the family wealth, because they were third or fourth children. So they came to India actually to make quick money, and it is really so surprising that they came at such a young age, and the company officials sitting in London, they noticed that these young boys that we are sending, they don't know anything about their own culture, but they have succumbed to the disease of Indianization. This is not my words. So they said they are living like Hindus. They know everything about Hinduism, the culture, the tradition, and they're living like that, but they don't know anything about their own tradition. So this alienation from what was regarded as alienation from British culture or English culture became a cause of concern in East India Company in England at a particular point. This was also the time when James Mill, he had never been to India, he had not written a word on India, he began writing his History of British India in 6 volumes. So we have these two developments. So the first development, the East India Company takes care of that by establishing a college in England, Haileybury College. And they said that everyone whom we select to be employed in our service in India has to first spend 3 years or 2 years in Haileybury College, so that he comes to know about his own tradition and civilization. And the standard textbook that was imposed in that college was James Mill's History of British India. Now that James Mill's History of British India, it had one basic theme, and that was to denigrate Indian civilization and to make the people who are selected inculcate a sense of superiority. So this is one part of the answer to your question. But you asked about biblical history. You see, in the 18th century, there was a bishop, Bishop Usher was his name, and he wrote a book in which he tried to fit history of the world, in accordance with what he thought was the time frame given in the Bible. So he said that the great flood took place about 4,000 years ago. And so everything has to fit into the time frame. But when you look at India, if we look at the Purans, then you know their time frame is hundreds of thousands of years. So there was this problem. William Jones and all was sympathetic, but there was this problem that how do we fit in Indian history with the biblical time frame? So in fact, William Jones, he's written over there that, you know, I cannot disprove or write against this time frame, the Genesis. So it has to be fitted within that. So, you know, there were these tensions that they had, these dilemmas that they had, because Indian chronology was pointing in one way and the Bible was pointing in one. So my answer to your question is in two parts. The first part is what I said last, that is how to fit Indian history where everything is in tens of thousands of years, according to the texts, according to the Purans, with the biblical time frame as decided by Bishop Usher in the 18th century. That is the first part. The second part is that the Indians, the Englishmen who were coming to India were getting so influenced and overwhelmed by what they perceived in India that the company became alarmed that they cannot be representatives of British rule because they're more conversant with Indian civilization than with British. So in 1806, they set up Haileybury College in England, where everyone had to study for 3 years. And the objective was to make them, to educate them about their own history. And the standard textbook that was prescribed was James Mill's History of British India, which was designed to create a distance between them and the Indian people.
Very clear. You mentioned actually chronology, because if you look at actually our history, as in like in the Itihasas and everything, they have mentioned actually the succession of kings until Rama, and from there actually we can see the succession from there. Even Mahabharata mentions from Rama how many kings were there, and they give a chronology of the kings that ruled the country and all that. And even further than that, we had an extensive chronology of the kings that ruled India, and we can get all the names. So how did they manage to destroy this chronology is first part of my question. And the second is, even though actually we had this illustrious history or wealth of history with us, they still managed to get their version of history superior over our own history, our own indigenous history. And even today, people would think the history wrote by the Europeans are the correct one than the ones actually we had here. How did they manage to do it?
See, as far as the time frame, you've mentioned that, the Itihas. Itihas means as it happened. So millions of Hindus believe in the historicity of Lord Rama, and they also believe in the events which are discussed in detail in the Mahabharata. I think that, some attempts have been made to, study this. But I think for me as a historian, what is more relevant for the Indian civilizational journey is how these two epics became national epics, and there was no part of India they did not try to include itself in the national epics. So, every region would say, Ram came here, or our king contributed to the Mahabharata war. And in fact, Camille Bulke, in the colonial period, he tried to count how many versions of the Ramayana were there. You see, because in Tamil Nadu, you have an own version. Kamban was the person who wrote that version. So there is no part of India which does not have Ramayana in Bengali or Assamese or Oriya, whatever. So Kamil Bulke, Father Kamil Bulke, he counted 300 tellings of the Ramayana. You know, so the chronology for me is really not that important as its role in binding everyone of this subcontinent together. So this is as far as Ramayana is concerned. 300 versions he found. Versions means that it was not diametrically opposite to the Ramayana that we know, but you know, somebody would say that add their own local dimension to the Ramayana and tell it in their own language. The same was true of the Mahabharata. In fact, in the Pandya kingdom, there is an inscription that, as far as I recall, it's of the 10th century Common Era. And what I found fascinating about that inscription was that the king says, our region contributed to the Mahabharata war, we fed the armies of this group. So many millennia after the war is over, the kings are saying that, you know, we contributed to the war because we fed the armies of this group. So that, you know, it's there in the civilizational memory. And there is another inscription that is, it'll come to me where it is. It's there in a temple in South India, Southern India. And it says that, you know, so many years have elapsed since the Great War. So that inscription says so many thousand years have elapsed since the Great War. So, you know, for the people of the subcontinent, it was very much a part of their consciousness. And they're going on dating the war. When did it happen? The commonly accepted dating is that 3100 BC marked the death of Krishna. Now, this 3100 BC is such a widely accepted date that obviously something very important happened then. We don't know what happened, but every part of India says that Kali Yuga begins in 3100 BC with the death of Krishna. So that is another point. It's not the chronology of the kings, but how it remains a living, you know, part of our living consciousness. And just third point, if I may, am I taking too much time?
Not at all.
No, not at
Go
all.
ahead.
Okay. So, you know, I want to say something which your viewers should know about the spread of the Mahabharata epic. Now, in 1910, around 1910, Professor Suktankar, one of the most leading, you know, Indologists of India, he and his team at the Bori, Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institution, they said we will prepare a critical edition of the Mahabharata. Because like the Ramayana, there are so many versions of the Mahabharata. So critical edition means that what is the core which is common to all editions of the Mahabharata? You know, whether it's in Tamil, whether it's in whatever. So what is that core? And that will be the critical edition, because that will be as close as possible to what Valmiki wrote. So they got manuscripts from all over North India, and they found that the Sharda manuscript was the closest, the shortest. The shortest will be the closest because it will have least scope for additions. You understand? So in the south, in southern India, they looked for many, they got many texts of the Mahabharata, In the Tamil region, it was so elaborate, it had become almost double the size of the northern this thing. So that means they were later editions. But they was shocked to know that the shortest edition came from Kerala. And they said, Kerala is so far from North India, the other extreme of India. So how did the shortest version, which will be as close as possible to the original, how did it reach Kerala? Then one scholar traced the journey of the Mahabharata. I'm giving this story, it doesn't answer your question directly, but it's very, very interesting. I found it very interesting. So this scholar discovered that around 500 BC, 500 Brahmin families migrated from Mathura region and went to the Tamil region. 500 Brahmin families, so that there would be no problem of marriage and all that, because all the goths would be represented. So they took with them the version of the Mahabharata that was current in Mathura when they left that and went to the Tamil region. So they stayed in the Tamil region till the 7th, 8th century. In the 7th, 8th century, an event occurred that is called the Kalbra interregnum. What it was, we really don't know, but we know the name. And then they migrated with the Mahabharata that they brought from Mathura and they went to Kerala. And it was, that version was frozen from the time it left Mathura till the time it reached Kerala. And who are these people? These are the Nambudri Brahmins. Can you imagine? And so, every bit of our civilizational journey is so fascinating that, I can go on and on, because it is, you have to feel the joy of discovering how our civilization, our history, all blended, and what a continuity it was. I think I've gone totally off track.
But it is a really fascinating story to hear. It will be really interesting to hear that, that the shortest version was from the south. I mean, I am from south, so
Kerala.
Yes.
In Kerala, I couldn't.
Yes, Kerala.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to know about that.
Absolutely. The next question is actually also directly related to the question that I asked before. Our scientific accomplishments, like Ujjain back in the day was actually a center of science and education, like mathematics and all was very famous for Ujjain. And we have Kerala School of Mathematics. We have medicines, like you mentioned, actually from different areas. The religion and science was not separate for us. It went hand in hand.
Yes.
And the question is actually, how did they undermine our accomplishments? When we look at the accomplishments, actually, even we study that Earth was round, was discovered by Europeans. But we had that records in our education system way before that. How did they overcome that, put their accomplishments ahead of us?
India's reputation for its scientific attainments was very widespread in the ancient period. And certainly in the medieval period, many people came from outside to learn about it. And I'll just give you a very, very fascinating story before I come to the details. There was a European who was, who had come to India and was trying to learn about Indian knowledge. And one fine day, in the afternoon, it was very hot, and he decided to rest under a chhatri which was next to the temple. Chhatri is that umbrella-like structure that you find in temples. So he lay under the chhatri, and suddenly his eyes went to the ceiling. And when he saw the ceiling and he began to examine it, he was totally shocked, because he said that chhatri had engraved on it the entire zodiac and the entire movement. And he has written about that, and I've quoted that in my book, The India They Saw. And Playfair, I think he was a very important mathematician. He has, I've quoted that paper, he has written extensively on how accurate the Indian knowledge was on the movement of the sun, etc. So he says there is no doubt that well before anyone else, this knowledge was very much a part of the Indian heritage. So both these accounts I have written in my book. So anyone who's interested can look at that. I think it's volume 4. Now the thing is about how did they subvert. So, we are very fortunate that we have many accounts of the Indian education system before Macaulay minutes. The company officials, they wanted every district officer to send detailed reports of the number of schools in their region, who were the people who were studying there, what was the method of teaching, etc. And this Indian education system, it's called the Madras system. They called it the Madras system, and they took it back to England. So the Indian education system that they found over here, which they called the Madras system, they took back to their country. So this was their view, and such a favorable and valuable view that they recorded. And what did they write about this education system? They said it was cost effective. Cost effective was that the elder child will teach the younger student. So if a child is 10 years old, he will teach a child who's 6 years old. So that cuts down the cost. Then there is, how do you teach? You first make the child write the alphabets on sand. There is no paper, anything involved. Even the slate is not involved. So he will write on sand with his finger. And if he makes an error, you just remove the sand and it becomes a fresh piece of sand for him to write on. So, this is the way they taught first how to write and then only to read. So these were very, very fascinating accounts that we have, eyewitness accounts of British officials on the Indian education system. Now, history moves in a very strange fashion. Why did the British change their view of India? Why? As they began to rule over greater parts of India, the administrative costs became very prohibitive because an Englishman, you have to pay him much more than you will pay an Indian. So the need for Indian clerks was the most important factor that determined British policies. They needed a large number of low-level clerks who would be paid 1/10 that an Englishman would have to be paid. So the nature of education that the British promoted became very different from what it was in the original scheme when they came to India. I am not by any chance saying that the indigenous system of education was perfect. Things degenerate with time and they have to be revitalized. And the shortcomings, they have to be removed. But that was not the main purpose of the British intervention in education. It was to provide clerks. Now, another important player in this was the missionaries. The missionaries were not motivated by the desire to improve the lot of the Indians. They were motivated by the desire to convert them. So they also set up a parallel system which would help them to convert natives. So there was a debate on whether we should use English as the medium or whether we should use vernacular, which will be more effective in conversion. And then what are the texts that we are going to teach in the schools? the texts were very carefully chosen that subtly, not overtly, they will promote the British agenda. So it's a multi-pronged attack that begins with the ascendancy of the British in India. So I think your 1 hour is up.
We will take one more question from the moderators and then we will open
for
sure.
The
audience.
I don't think I'm trying to avoid your questions, by the way.
Not at all, Meenakshi Ji. We are just, enjoying listening to you speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Giving the answers. Yeah.
You're so kind.
Not at all.
Yes, Ravi.
We are learning so much. Yeah. So coming back to, about, for example, something like the caste systems, how were they introduced and in what way did it go forward dividing the people, and other practices like sati, untouchability, if you could throw light on that.
No, there are very many questions that are involved in your one question. So, because caste is very different and sati is a totally different thing. So, since I've written a book on sati, I might just first talk about sati, then we can discuss caste and varna, because caste system is actually related to British census policies. Okay, so to briefly talk about sati, we were, at least when I was in school, that guilt complex that is thrust on you, that you used to burn women. So what are you, championing? What cause are you championing? Because yours was such a degraded society and culture. But the fact of the matter is very different. I'll just briefly sum it up. There was no religious sanction to sati. I've examined so many texts beginning from the Rig Veda up till the 17th century, and 99.9% of them condemn it. And they say that sati is like black magic. You will not get anything. And all the texts recommend a chaste life for a widow. They say that the widow should lead a chaste life. There is no religious sanction to widow immolation in the ancient texts. Now, what happens is that it is very interesting that all the accounts that we get of sati are from Bengal, where Bengal does not have a tradition of sati. Sati was an institution that was actually restricted to Rajasthan, largely to Rajasthan, Sati and Johar. And the reason for that is that these people were engaged in warfare against invaders. And the women did not want to fall into the hands of the invaders. So they reasoned that if our husband is going to lose the war or his army is going to lose, we will collectively commit Johar or instances of sati. In fact, 2 recorded instances of sati are first when Alauddin Khalji attacked Chittor, and the second when Akbar attacked. So these are recorded instances of sati and Johar. I mean, not sati, but of Johar. But the individual cases that we get from Rajasthan are also not before the 9th century. So to say that sati is an ancient custom is wrong. I did a statistical analysis of how many cases of sati there were. I'm by no chance saying that sati was not there. The first authentic recorded case of sati is in the time of Alexander, when Alexander came to India. When he was going back, that he had a troop of Indian soldiers. So one of them died. And then his 2 widows came and they started quarreling among themselves who will immolate with him. So the Greek soldiers were absolutely stunned and shocked. So that is an eyewitness account. Then we have an inscription mentioning Sati, and that is 5th century AD. So if you're talking about Alexander 4th century and 5th century AD, so you can imagine how many hundreds of years have passed. And this inscription that we have is of a widow whose husband has died in battle. So then we have Ibn Battuta. He was a Moroccan traveler, and he came to India, and he records that, at this place, I saw 3 women ready to immolate themselves. And he says, why are they immolating? He says that their husbands had died fighting the Sumras in Sindh. So he even gives the location where the husbands had died. So there is no reason for us to disbelieve. The point to note is that the instances of Sati, first of all, were never sanctioned by any religious text. They were very few and far between. The point is, how is it suddenly in the 19th century, we hear of 50,000 annual immolations, 90,000 annual immolations. So these reports were actually mostly prepared by British missionaries. Because the East India Company said, we have come to India to make money. We have not come here on a reform agenda. So we will not allow missionaries to operate in the territory that we have conquered, because we don't want to disrupt the trade, etc. And if any missionary comes in British-controlled territory, we will send him back on the next ship. So this is what they did. They were so particular. But the missionaries, they were determined to convert, so they presented the case to the British Parliament. And there they concocted figures. They said, so many thousands of widows are immolating every year. And it's very interesting that the British missionaries never talked about the number of women who were being burnt as witches in England at the same time. And so in any case, under the pressure, and the whole thing was so well orchestrated. I've discussed how this campaign was orchestrated, manufacturing a debate, if I can put it that way. And then finally, Parliament gave them the right to convert. And when William Bentinck came to India, he abolished Sati. Now, what is most surprising, that after William Bentinck abolished Sati, we don't hear of a single case in Bengal of Sati. Can you imagine that the population abided by the edict so faithfully? Even today, with all the means of communication, no government order is implemented and accepted on day one. So it shows that, and even today, the widows of Bengal, you'll find them in Vrindavan. The tradition was that they would go to Vrindavan rather than to commit Sati. So it's a manufactured debate, as I said, manufactured by British missionaries. And one more thing, the French were in India, and there is one very famous French Jesuit missionary, Abbe de Boy. He lived in India for almost 3 decades. And he wrote back letters which have been published under the title Letters on the State of Christianity in India. And he talked about the South. And he says everywhere, first of all, he said the Baptist missionaries are defaming. He's a Jesuit missionary. He's talking about Baptist missionaries defaming India. And he says that here I see shaved widows everywhere. What are they talking about? So he's talking about shaved widows that he sees all over. And he says that in 30 years of living in India, I don't think I've come across even a single instance of Sati in the South. And he says, what's even more important, he says that the Hindus are a conversion resistance population. He said in 3 decades, I don't think I've been able to convert 3. They they cannot be converted. So he makes two very important points. One is that the Sati was a phenomena that was exaggerated by the British Baptist missionaries, and he didn't see anything in the South. And he says he sees widows with shaved head. And then he also talks about the absolute impossibility of converting the people.
Time is up for the moderator questions. So I will open it up for the audience.